A German field surgeon's hands freeze mid-operation, North Africa, 1943. The American prisoner on his table shouldn't be alive. 3 weeks ago, shrapnel tore through this soldier's abdomen. Infection should have killed him in 5 days. Every German wounded the same way died within a week. This is the story of the invisible weapon that saved more American lives than any tank or bomber, and the enemy doctors who couldn't understand what they were seeing. December 22, 1943, Field Hospital, Anzio Beachhead, Italy. Captain Robert Mitchell pressed his stethoscope against the chest of Private James Chen and heard what should have been impossible: clear lungs, strong heartbeat, steady breathing. 48 hours ago, Chen's right leg looked like raw meat. A German 88mm shell fragment had torn through his thigh, shattering bone, severing muscle, exposing femur to the December cold. The wound was a textbook case for amputation or death. Mitchell straightened up, pulled back the bandage, clean pink tissue, no pus, no smell of rot. "How's it feel, Private?" Chen's voice was weak but clear. "Like I might keep it, sir." Mitchell had seen this exact wound kill 7 men in the past month. German soldiers, Italian civilians, even 2 British POWs before the supply shipments arrived. The difference wasn't surgical skill. It wasn't luck. It was 6 small vials of yellowish powder, each marked with a single word that most Americans couldn't pronounce: penicillin. 60 miles north, in a converted monastery serving as a German field hospital, Dr. Klaus Hermann was making notes he knew he shouldn't share. The American captain they'd captured 3 days ago should have been dead. Hermann had seen the field reports: a bullet through the shoulder, entry wound the size of a penny, exit wound the size of a fist. 14 days in a makeshift POW cage. No proper medical care, winter temperatures, mud, everything that bred infection. Yet when Hermann examined him, the wound was closing, healing from the inside out. No fever, no sepsis. The captain even joked with the guards. Hermann checked his notes from the previous month. 11 German soldiers, similar wounds, all dead within 10 days. Gangrene or blood poisoning. The choice was which killed you first. He wrote carefully in small letters: "Americans possess unknown treatment. Investigate." What he didn't write, the word that kept him awake at night: impossible. The story begins not on a battlefield, but in a London laboratory, September 1928. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist with a reputation for messiness, returned from vacation to find his Petri dishes contaminated. Mold had grown on several plates of Staphylococcus bacteria. Most scientists would have cursed and thrown them away. Fleming looked closer. Around each patch of mold, the bacteria had died. Something in that fuzzy growth was killing one of medicine's deadliest enemies. He named it penicillin after the Penicillium mold. Then he tried to isolate it. Failed. Tried to produce it in quantity. Failed. By 1940, penicillin was a laboratory curiosity, fascinating but useless for actual medicine. Then came Pearl Harbor. War transforms priorities. Impossibilities become necessities. In 1942, the U.S. government approached pharmaceutical companies with a problem. American soldiers were dying from infected wounds at the same rate as soldiers in World War I. 25 years of medical progress and a bullet wound still meant a coin flip with death. Infection killed more men than enemy fire. The government had a possible solution, a mold, a theory, and a desperate need to mass-produce something that had never been mass-produced before. Pfizer's chief scientist, Jasper Kane, looked at the requirements and told his bosses it would take 5 years and might not work at all. The military said they needed it in 18 months. Kane started working weekends. The challenge wasn't just scientific, it was industrial. Penicillin mold grew slowly, produced tiny amounts of the active compound, and died if you looked at it wrong. Early samples were so weak they contained only 1% actual penicillin. The rest was impurities. Engineers who normally designed chocolate factories and beer breweries suddenly found themselves growing mold in 10,000-gallon tanks. They used techniques from cheese making, bread baking, and sheer improvisation. When glass containers couldn't handle the volume, they switched to steel. When steel contaminated the mold, they lined the tanks with porcelain. By July 1943, American factories were producing 425 million units of penicillin monthly. By D-Day, June 1944, that number had reached 100 billion units. It was the fastest industrial scale-up in human history. And it meant that every American soldier boarding a ship to Europe carried something the enemy didn't have, a realistic chance of surviving their wounds. If that fact surprises you as much as it surprised enemy doctors, hit that like button to tell me you want more forgotten stories from history's shadows. Now back to the battlefield. March 15, 1944, Cassino, Italy. Sergeant William Foster took the bullet at Yo 600 hours during the third assault on Monte Cassino. It entered just below his collarbone, tumbled through tissue, nicked his lung, and lodged against his spine. He was conscious when they pulled him off the mountain, conscious when they loaded him into the ambulance, conscious when the medic leaned over him with a syringe and said, "This is going to hurt like hell, but it's going to save your life." The injection site burned. Foster had been shot, and somehow the cure felt worse. 3 days later, he was sitting up. 5 days later, he was complaining about the food. A week later, he was pestering the doctors about when he could return to his unit. In the bed next to him, an Italian partisan with a similar wound had died on day 4. Blood poisoning. His body couldn't fight the bacteria flooding his system. Foster asked why. The doctor's answer was brief. "We've got medicine. They don't." That was the secret, not tactics, not bravery, not even superior firepower. Medicine. A moldy extract in a small glass vial. German military intelligence knew something was wrong by early 1944. American casualty reports weren't matching projections. Wounded soldiers who should have died in field hospitals were returning to duty. The infection mortality rate among captured Americans was inexplicably low, under 1%. For German soldiers with comparable wounds, it hovered near 15%. In Berlin, Wehrmacht medical officers compiled reports from field surgeons across 3 fronts. The consensus was disturbing. American military medicine had achieved a breakthrough. The nature of that breakthrough remained unclear. Some theories, better surgical techniques. Possible, but unlikely to account for such dramatic differences. Superior antiseptics. Already investigated, standard iodine and sulfa drugs. Some kind of blood treatment. Unverifiable without captured samples. The truth was in those captured samples, sitting in medical depots in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. Small vials, labeled in English, marked Penicillin G, or simply Pen. German chemists analyzed them, identified a complex organic compound, attempted synthesis, failed, tried fermentation, failed, tried alternate production methods, failed. The problem wasn't understanding penicillin. German scientists understood it perfectly. The problem was making it. That required industrial capacity, factories, equipment, expertise, and time that Germany by 1944 no longer had. April 1944, a German field hospital 20 miles behind the Gothic line. Dr. Hermann finally received permission to question an American medical officer, a captain captured during a raid on a field hospital near Anzio. The captain's name was Robert Mitchell, the same Mitchell who'd treated Private Chen 4 months earlier. "Tell me about your miracle drug," Hermann said in careful English. Mitchell looked at him for a long moment. "What miracle drug?" "Don't insult me, Captain. We've analyzed the vials. We know you have something new. Your wounded survive at impossible rates." Mitchell's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Not defiance, calculation. He was deciding how much to say. "We've improved our surgical protocols, better training, better—" "Captain," Hermann's voice was sharp. "I've been a surgeon for 20 years. I know surgical skill when I see it. This isn't skill. This is chemistry." Silence. Then Mitchell spoke, and his voice was quiet. "Would you use it?" If you had it? On your own men? Of course. Then I'll tell you. Mitchell leaned forward. It's called penicillin. It kills bacteria. It's extracted from mold, Penicillium chrysogenum. We inject it every 4 hours for severe infections. It works on gangrene, sepsis, pneumonia, most bacterial infections. And you can't make it. Your industry can't produce it. We barely can. And we've been trying since 1942. Herman wrote nothing down. Some things you don't commit to paper when you're losing a war. How many lives? He asked. How many lives has it saved? Herman nodded. Mitchell's answer was immediate. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more. Every soldier who'd have died from an infected wound, every pneumonia case who'd have drowned in his own lungs. We're winning the war with bullets and bombs, Doctor. But we're saving it with mold. The mathematics of military medicine are brutal and simple. Before penicillin, for every 100 American soldiers wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization, approximately 8 to 10 died from infection. This number was actually an improvement over WWI, thanks to sulfa drugs and better surgery, but it was still catastrophic. After penicillin, that number dropped to less than 1. Do the math. The U.S. Army recorded roughly 670,000 wounded personnel in the European and Mediterranean theaters alone. Pre-penicillin death rate, 53,000 to 67,000 dead from infection. Actual death rate, under 6,700. Penicillin saved approximately 50,000 American lives in Europe. Add the Pacific Theater, another 25,000. Account for Allied forces who received American penicillin, tens of thousands more. But raw numbers don't capture the strategic impact. Those saved soldiers weren't just statistics. They were experienced combat veterans, trained specialists, men who'd learned to fight, to lead, to survive, and who could return to their units instead of filling cemetery plots. An army that gets its veterans back is an army that gets better at war. June 6, 1944, D-Day, Normandy beaches. Every American soldier hitting Omaha Beach carried a small packet in his first aid kit. Sulfa powder for immediate treatment, morphine for pain, and if he was lucky enough to reach an aid station, a new item recently added to medical supply chains, a ready-to-inject dose of penicillin. Lieutenant Thomas Riley took machine gun fire in the first wave. 3 rounds, 1 through his calf, 1 through his forearm, 1 that grazed his ribs and kept going. He was bleeding in shock and certain he was dying when a medic dragged him behind a disabled Sherman tank. The medic worked fast. Tourniquet, pressure dressing, then a syringe. "What's that?" Riley managed to ask. "Medicine." The medic didn't look up. "New stuff. Keeps the infection out." "You're going to make it, Lieutenant. Just stay still." Riley passed out. When he woke, he was on a hospital ship, and his wounds were hot but clean. No smell of rot, no fever dreams, just pain, fatigue, and the strange realization that he wasn't going to die. 3 weeks later, he was back with his unit. The bullet holes had scarred, but the muscles worked. He could walk, shoot, lead his men. 75 years earlier, those same wounds would have killed him slowly in a field hospital tent, gangrene eating through tissue, while doctors stood helpless. Now he was alive, fighting, because of mold. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next incredible story that history books forgot, because what happened next changed medicine forever. By late 1944, word of penicillin had spread through the Wehrmacht like wildfire. Not official word. The High Command wasn't advertising American medical superiority, but the whispered kind. Soldiers talked. Medics compared notes. And everyone noticed that American POWs seemed impossibly resilient. In a bunker outside Aachen, a German lieutenant named Franz Weber faced a choice. His sergeant had taken shrapnel to the leg. The wound was infected. Weber could see the red streaks crawling up the man's thigh. Sepsis. Maybe 12 hours before it killed him. They had morphine. They had sulfa powder, which hadn't worked. They had a field surgeon who could amputate, but the sergeant was already too weak for surgery. He'd bleed out. They also had 2 vials taken from a captured American medical depot. Small glass bottles. English labels. Penicillin G, 100,000 units. Weber held 1 vial up to the light. Clear liquid. Could be anything. Could be poison, for all he knew. The Americans might have planted false supplies precisely for this situation. The sergeant's breathing was shallow, rapid, skin hot to the touch. Weber made the decision, injected the full vial, waited. 6 hours later, the sergeant's fever broke. 12 hours later, he was drinking water. 24 hours later, the wound stopped oozing pus. Weber said nothing in his official report, but he kept the empty vial. A souvenir from a war where the enemy's greatest weapon turned out to be mercy. The Pacific Theater told the same story, but with higher stakes. Jungle warfare bred infections faster than any European battlefield. Tropical diseases, malaria, dengue, dysentery, complicated every wound. Before penicillin, a simple cut could become a death sentence. After penicillin, soldiers survived bullet wounds that would have been fatal in the Philippines in 1942. Corporal James Chen, the same Chen whose leg Captain Mitchell had saved in Italy, finished the war in Okinawa. He took a grenade fragment to the shoulder in April 1945. Painful, bloody, but not fatal. The medics pumped him full of penicillin, and 3 weeks later he was clearing caves with his unit. He wrote a letter home to California. One line stayed with him his entire life. Mom, they've got medicine now that does what prayer couldn't. I should be dead 3 times over, but I'm coming home. He did come home. So did 50,000 other American soldiers who wouldn't have without penicillin. They came home to build families, start businesses, vote in elections, shape the country's future. An entire generation of men who existed because chemists figured out how to grow mold in tanks. The Japanese military never acquired penicillin in meaningful quantities. Japanese soldiers died from infected wounds at rates comparable to WWI. Their medics had sulfa drugs, which helped, but sulfa couldn't touch the kinds of deep tissue infections that penicillin eliminated. By 1945, Japanese casualty reports showed infection mortality rates 3 to 4 times higher than American rates. This wasn't just a humanitarian tragedy, it was a strategic disaster. Every soldier lost to infection was a soldier who couldn't defend Iwo Jima, Okinawa, or the home islands. Every trained pilot grounded by pneumonia was 1 less zero in the sky. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by American bombing and naval blockades, couldn't pivot to penicillin production. They barely had enough resources to manufacture ammunition. Pharmaceutical innovation was a luxury for nations winning wars, not losing them. May 8, 1945, VE Day, Berlin. Dr. Klaus Hermann sat in a rubble-strewn office with a bottle of schnapps and a stack of medical reports. The war was over. Germany had lost. He'd known it would end this way for months, maybe years. But what haunted him wasn't the defeat. It was the counting. He'd kept informal records throughout the war, his own research never submitted to official channels, wound types, infection rates, mortality rates, German versus American, Italian versus British, Japanese versus Australian. The pattern was clear. The Allies had penicillin. The Axis didn't. Everything else flowed from that single fact. His final calculation, written in the margin of a supply requisition form. Conservative estimate. German forces lost 75,000, 100,000 soldiers to bacterial infections that American medicine could have prevented. We didn't lose the war because of this medicine, but we couldn't win without it. He burned the papers that night. Some truths are too bitter to preserve. The real story of penicillin isn't just medical, it's industrial. American pharmaceutical companies produced 2.3 million doses of penicillin in 1943. By 1945, that number had reached 650 billion units, enough to treat every wounded soldier in every Allied army, plus millions of civilian patients. That scale-up required 21 major pharmaceutical plants working 24-hour shifts, 10,000 workers trained in aseptic fermentation techniques, novel deep tank fermentation technology developed specifically for penicillin, a supply chain stretching from corn farms, corn-steeped liquor was the best growth medium, to frontline aid stations, quality control standards that didn't exist before 1942. The Germans understood penicillin's chemistry. They could analyze samples. They could even produce small laboratory quantities. What they couldn't do was mobilize an entire industrial ecosystem to manufacture it at scale while simultaneously building tanks, planes, and ammunition. That was the real miracle. Not that penicillin worked, but that America figured out how to make it work for millions of people simultaneously. June 1945, a Veterans Hospital, San Diego, California. Captain Robert Mitchell walked the wards, checking on patients. His war was over. No more Italian beaches, no more morphine-soaked field surgeries. Just American soldiers recovering in clean beds with regular meals and nurses who didn't duck artillery fire. In bed 14, Private James Chen was reading a magazine. His leg had healed. Ugly scar, but full range of motion. He'd walk with a slight limp forever, but he'd walk. "Heading home next week," Chen said. "Doc says I'm cleared." Mitchell nodded. "That leg should have killed you. 3 different ways. Traumatic shock, blood loss, infection. You won the lottery, Chen." "Wasn't lottery, sir. Was medicine." "Medicine and luck." Chen shook his head. "Just medicine. I've been talking to the other guys. Same story over and over. Wounds that would have killed our fathers, killed our brothers in the First War. But we got this." He gestured vaguely, searching for the word. "Penicillin." "Yeah, that. Makes you think." "About what?" Chen looked out the window at the San Diego sun, the palm trees, the Pacific. "About how many guys from my dad's war would still be alive if they'd had what we had. How many sons would have known their fathers? Makes you think we were lucky, not just lucky to survive, lucky to be born now instead of then." Mitchell had no answer to that. It was true. Timing was everything. 20 years earlier, or even 10, and Chen's generation would have died the same way every other generation had died, slowly, painfully, from infections that medicine couldn't touch. They were born at the exact right moment in history, when science caught up to suffering. The post-war world belonged to penicillin. By 1946, it was available to civilians. Scarlet fever, once a death sentence for children, became a treatable illness. Pneumonia stopped being called the old man's friend, the disease that quietly ended elderly lives. Syphilis, tuberculosis, even common infected cuts, all became manageable with antibiotics. Life expectancy jumped. Infant mortality dropped. Surgery became safer because surgeons no longer feared post-operative infections. The soldiers who'd received penicillin on battlefields went home and told everyone about the miracle drug. Their children grew up in a world where bacterial infections were inconveniences, not death sentences. Their grandchildren can't imagine a time when a scratched knee could kill you. But the veterans remembered. They remembered being told they'd lose a leg, then keeping it. They remembered fevers that broke overnight. They remembered friends who died in 1942 from wounds that wouldn't have killed them in 1944. They carried that knowledge quietly, like shrapnel that never worked its way out. The understanding that their survival was contingent, that they'd won a lottery of timing and chemistry. August 2003, a hospital room, Phoenix, Arizona. James Chen, age 82, lay in a hospital bed with pneumonia. His lungs, weakened by age and the lingering effects of that grenade fragment in 1945, struggled to process oxygen. He'd been coughing for a week. Now he couldn't catch his breath. The doctor entered with a syringe, modern antibiotics, third-generation cephalosporins, far more potent than 1940s penicillin. But the principle was the same: chemistry versus bacteria. "This should help," the doctor said. Chen watched the injection, felt the cold sensation as the antibiotic entered his bloodstream, and thought, not for the first time, about that field hospital in Italy. Mitchell's steady hands, the yellowish powder dissolved in saline, the fever that broke, the leg that stayed, 60 years. He'd lived 60 years on borrowed time, had children, grandchildren, built a business, voted in 15 presidential elections, paid 40 years of taxes, taught his daughter to drive, walked his granddaughter down the aisle at her wedding, all because of mold and tanks. And engineers who figured out how to grow that mold faster than the enemy could kill you. The pneumonia broke. Chen went home 2 days later, lived another 6 years, died peacefully in his sleep in 2009 at age 88. At his funeral, his daughter mentioned that he always said he'd been lucky, born at the right time, fought in the right war, received the right medicine, made it home. She didn't know about the German soldiers who died from his wounds, the Japanese soldiers who'd never had access to antibiotics, the razor-thin margin between survival and death that penicillin represented. But Chen knew. He carried that knowledge until the end. The understanding that history turns on invisible things, mold spores, chemical compounds, industrial capacity, timing. He'd been on the right side of history, and it had made all the difference. The final count is staggering. Penicillin saved approximately 100,000 Allied soldiers' lives during Double Tain. It returned 15,000 wounded soldiers per month to active duty who otherwise would have died or been permanently disabled. It reduced infection mortality from 10% to under 1%. But numbers can't capture what it meant to the individuals. The sergeant who kept his leg, the pilot who survived pneumonia, the lieutenant who walked again, the private who went home. They won the war with bullets and bombs. But they survived it with medicine, a secret weapon that wasn't a weapon at all, just science, industry, and desperate innovation. The Axis doctors were horrified when they learned the truth, not because penicillin was cruel, but because it was effective, because their soldiers died while American soldiers lived, because the gap between the two sides wasn't just military, it was medical, industrial, fundamental. One side had figured out how to keep men alive, the other side hadn't. In total war, that difference decided everything. Dr. Herman's estimation was correct. Germany didn't lose the war because it lacked penicillin. But they couldn't win without it, not against an enemy who could pour resources into pharmaceutical research while simultaneously building bombers, not against a nation that could mobilize corn farmers, cheese makers, and chemical engineers into a single industrial effort, not against a war machine that treated soldiers as investments worth saving. The German military medical service was competent, often excellent. Their surgeons were skilled. Their field hospitals were organized. But they lacked the one thing that mattered most in 1944, a way to stop bacteria from killing wounded soldiers. American industry provided that, not through superior strategy or tactics, but through sheer productive capacity, the ability to make billions of units of a complex organic compound and deliver it to men bleeding in foxholes from Normandy to Okinawa. That was America's true secret weapon, not the atomic bomb which ended the war. Not the tank production which won battles, but the industrial pharmaceutical complex that kept soldiers alive long enough to fight those battles. Penicillin didn't win WO2, but it saved the men who did. Fleming, the Scottish bacteriologist who discovered penicillin in 1928, received the Nobel Prize in 1945. He shared it with Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, the researchers who figured out how to purify and produce it. In his acceptance speech, Fleming said something that the veterans would have understood. The time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. He was right. Antibiotic resistance would become a crisis by the 21st century. But in 1945, that warning seemed impossibly distant. The war was over. The medicine had worked. Soldiers were coming home. That was miracle enough. Captain Mitchell retired from the Army in 1946, became a civilian surgeon in Baltimore. He never forgot the men he'd saved, or the ones he couldn't save. He kept a photograph from Italy, himself and Chen standing outside that field hospital in Anzio, both grinning like idiots. Chen's leg was healed enough to stand on. The war was still raging. But for one moment, medicine had won. Mitchell died in 1987. At his funeral, a stranger appeared, an old man walking with a cane, James Chen. He'd flown from California to Maryland to pay respects. "He saved my leg," Chen told Mitchell's children. "Probably saved my life. Definitely saved my future. I had 60 good years because your father knew what to do with a vial of mold and a prayer." Mitchell's daughter asked what he meant by mold. Chen smiled. It was a long story, but he had time. He told her about penicillin, about field hospitals and German prisoners, and the invisible weapon that won the war. About medicine and industry and the intersection of luck and science. She listened and understood for the first time what her father had actually done during the war. He hadn't just treated wounds. He'd used chemistry to fight death. And won more often than he lost. That was the real miracle.